The Library of Alexandria, Humanity's Lost Memory. Ladies and gentlemen, fast-paced travelers through history, welcome aboard. This is your captain speaking. We have planned today's journey to last approximately 15 minutes. The weather is clear, with an expected temperature of around 22 degrees. As soon as our flight attendants finish distributing the refreshments, our journey will continue with the same sense of excitement and humor. Please recline your seats. Fastening your seatbelts is optional. After all, we're here to have fun, aren't we? And most importantly, enjoy the ride. Human history is, in essence, a struggle against forgetting. Humanity has always feared losing what it knows. That fear was already present in the first figures drawn on cave walls and in the first words carved into clay tablets, because humanity realized something very early on. Knowledge that is not remembered is as if it never existed. In the ancient world, there were many cities. Cities with powerful armies, cities that built wealthy ports, cities adorned with magnificent temples. But only one city stood apart from all of these. It chose to draw its power not from swords or stone, but from knowledge. That city was the magnificent Alexandria. Founded after the death of Alexander the Great, this city was not designed as an ordinary settlement. Unlike all other cities, this one was meant to be built upon knowledge. From the very beginning, Alexandria was founded on a single idea. That idea was simple yet radical. The world may not be conquered, but the knowledge of the world can be collected, and whoever controlled knowledge could possess everything. The Ptolemaic dynasty turned this idea into state policy, so profoundly that knowledge was no longer a personal pursuit, but an imperial matter. Museion literally meant the house of the muses. That was the very reason it was built. Dedicated to the muses of inspiration, this structure was the ancestor of today's universities, academies, and research institutes. The scholars who lived there did not merely read texts, they debated, criticized, corrected, and rewrote them. The state provided them with salaries, food, and housing, because within these walls, thinking, producing, and questioning were not privileges, they were public duties. In short, it was an exclusive place. The aim of the Library of Alexandria was clear, yet deeply unsettling: to gather everything ever written by humanity. For the ancient world, this ambition bordered on arrogance, yet Alexandria was determined to achieve it. This is why the harbor was of critical importance. Ships arriving from every corner of the Mediterranean were not merely engaged in trade, they carried knowledge. When vessels entered the port, they were searched. Books, epics, mathematical treatises, and medical texts were collected. Officials copied these works, often keeping the originals in the library and returning the copies to their owners. They were, quite literally, famished for knowledge. Knowledge was no longer something that merely circulated. It had become a centralized power in the hands of the ruling intellect. Here, perhaps for the first time in history, texts were systematically compared. Different copies of the same work were placed side by side. Contradictions were identified. Errors were filtered out. Myths were open to criticism. Even the gods themselves became subjects of debate. Under this very roof, Euclid organized and systematized the fundamental axioms of geometry. Eratosthenes, using nothing more than the angles of shadows, calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing accuracy. Eratosthenes was not merely a scientist of the ancient world. He represented a fracture in human thought, a turning point that fundamentally changed humanity's perception of the universe. He was among the first to demonstrate that the world could be explained not by the will of the gods, but by measurement. Who was Eratosthenes? Eratosthenes was born around 276 BCE in Cyrene, modern-day Libya. He was a mathematician, astronomer, geographer, poet, and philosopher. What made him truly exceptional was not mastery of a single discipline, but his ability to synthesize knowledge across many fields. Because of this versatility, his contemporaries sometimes mockingly referred to him as beta, meaning second best in everything, first in nothing. History, however, reversed that label, for Eratosthenes accomplished something no one else had managed to do. He became the first at something no one had ever been first at before. The librarian of Alexandria. When Eratosthenes was invited to Alexandria, he was placed at the very heart of the Mausion. Shortly thereafter, he became the chief librarian of the Library of Alexandria. This role did not merely involve preserving books. It meant classifying knowledge, comparing sources, and subjecting them to critical examination. He was not content with simply accumulating information. He mapped knowledge. Hipparchus compiled star catalogs and recorded the movements of celestial bodies. For the first time, humanity was observing the universe with such methodical precision and such intellectual courage. But knowledge is always unsettling, because knowledge questions, because knowledge threatens established orders, because knowledge tests authority. By 48 BCE, Alexandria was no longer just a center of learning. It had become a field of political conflict. The Roman Republic was being torn apart by civil war. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in pursuit of Pompey, the city was already in the grip of crisis. The struggle for the throne between Cleopatra and her brother reached a breaking point with Caesar's arrival. Caesar supported Cleopatra. This choice triggered a massive uprising within the city. Roman forces became trapped in the harbor district. If the enemy fleet were to be captured, everything would be lost for Caesar. He needed a plan, and a decisive one. And Caesar made a decision that was militarily logical, yet historically catastrophic. The final order was clear. The ships would be burned. But fire cannot be controlled. Flames grow with the wind. They spread without restraint, and eventually, everything can turn to ash. By Caesar's command, the ships in the harbor were set ablaze. The fire expanded in an unpredictable manner and suddenly leaped into the warehouses along the port. These storage facilities contained copies belonging to the library, drafts and texts kept for commercial purposes. Papyrus, an ideal fuel, ignited instantly. The blaze soon spiraled beyond control. The fire had grown too large, and it could no longer be extinguished. At this point, the ancient sources become silent and contradictory. Plutarch writes that a great number of books were destroyed. Cassius Dio speaks of warehouses in the harbor district. None of them explicitly state that the library itself was completely destroyed, yet they all imply the same conclusion: an irreversible loss had occurred. This event may not have marked the absolute end of the Library of Alexandria, but it was undoubtedly its first major fracture. For the first time, knowledge had been left profoundly vulnerable, and that vulnerability only deepened with time. As the Roman Empire began to weaken, science and philosophy were pushed into the background. Scholars were no longer supported. Texts were no longer copied. Knowledge that was not copied was forgotten, and knowledge that was forgotten was, in effect, erased. The old excitement had faded. In time, new belief systems began to view earlier ways of thinking as threats. Philosophy was dangerous because it questioned. Astronomy undermined ideas of fate. Mathematics was dismissed as unnecessary on the grounds that it produced no immediate practical benefit. Decline had become inevitable, and it accelerated. Of course, the Library of Alexandria did not vanish in a single day. Over time, it withered away, melting down like a candle nearing its end. It was slowly abandoned. First, a hall was closed. Then, a scholar left the city. Then, a text was never copied again. And humanity, without even realizing it, erased its own past. If we return to the present day, today we do not know the complete list of what was lost. Perhaps Archimedes had discoveries that were never revealed. Perhaps there were medical texts explaining the origins of diseases. Perhaps theories that interpreted the universe from an entirely different perspective. Who knows? The tragedy of the Library of Alexandria is not merely that it burned. The true tragedy is that we will never know what we lost. The most expensive library the world has ever known disappeared in a single night. Today, we build digital archives. We store data in cloud systems. Yet Alexandria leaves us with a single lesson. Knowledge does not survive by being collected alone. It survives by being constantly protected, copied, and defended. Because sometimes a single spark can erase a future 1,000 years in the making.
Let us now summarize this topic in brief notes. 1. The Library of Alexandria was not a single building, but the core of a system. When considered on its own, the Library of Alexandria was not merely a building, it was the center of a broader system. The library did not consist of a single structure. The main library was located within the Mauseon, but there were also secondary libraries, such as the Serapeon. This structure is regarded as the earliest example of a centralized library system with additional branch libraries, comparable to modern library networks. 2. The ship inspection law, knowledge smuggling. The port of Alexandria was under strict supervision, and every ship entering the harbor was searched. Anything containing written text, books, scrolls, even personal notes, was temporarily confiscated. The originals were retained and stored in the library. Only copies were returned to the ship owners. This practice is considered the first known state-sponsored operation of seizing knowledge in history. 3. Texts in the library were divided into two categories: true or original manuscripts and ship copies. This classification shows that scholars were attempting to trace the lineage of texts. The foundations of textual criticism were laid here.
4. There was no silence in the library. Unlike modern libraries, Alexandria was not a quiet place. On the contrary, scholars debated loudly, texts were compared side by side, and ideas openly clashed. It was less an archive and more an intellectual laboratory. 5. The first academic salary system. Scholars of the Mauseon received a state salary, were exempt from taxes, were provided with free housing and food. This system represents the first full-time academic model in history. 6. Novels were written in the library. The scholars who worked tirelessly there also produced early forms of what we now call the novel. Writers such as Chariton and Heliodorus systematized fictional narrative. In other words, Alexandria was not only a center of science, but also a center of storytelling. 7. Homer was edited here. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey existed in different versions across various cities. Alexandrian scholars compared these texts, marked errors, and produced a standardized version. This process marked the birth of editing and philology and laid the foundations of many later theories. 8. Eratosthenes measured the earth without consulting the gods. He defended the facts. Eratosthenes' revolutionary achievement was not the calculation itself, but the method behind it. No myths, no prophecies, no divine explanations, only observation, geometry, and logic. This was humanity's first attempt to understand the universe in a fully secular way. 9. The library did not vanish in a single moment. Contrary to popular narratives, the library did not completely burn down in a single night. Over centuries, it gradually eroded in plain sight. Fires, neglect, political pressure, and economic collapse combined to make the outcome inevitable. The true destructive force, as one might expect, was indifference. 10.
At the time, the most dangerous knowledge was mathematics. In certain periods, mathematics was considered dangerous because it explained the order of the universe, weakened ideas of fate and divine planning, in other words, the authority of the gods, undermined power structures by stripping away the mystery of the unknowable. For this reason, some texts were deliberately not copied. 11. Alexandria was a language machine. The library housed texts in Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Persian, and Indian languages. The famous Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was produced here. It remains one of the most influential translation projects in history. 12. The scale of lost knowledge cannot be estimated. Estimates range between 40,000 and 400,000 scrolls, but the exact number is ultimately irrelevant, because even a single lost text could have delayed a technology, a medical treatment, an entire intellectual tradition for centuries. 13. The true legacy of Alexandria. Modern universities, academies, peer-reviewed journals, and the scientific method are all continuations of a single idea. Knowledge is not sacred. Knowledge must be questioned. This idea was first practiced systematically in Alexandria.